Hi, Razi.
Yes, hi.
Hi. How are you?
Good to see you, and
I know,
I'm
good
glad
to see
that
you
you
too.
are
Yeah.
you have come to speak
After,
here. So
yeah.
I saw you last
After a long
speaking
time
at
we meet.
Professor Rizwan Kaisar's memorial meeting. I heard you speaking, and
Oh, acha, you were there.
I was here.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm sure we will enjoy listening to you today, our students, and so many people will
I
be
hope
watching
so.
you. So many
I'm
people
not.
will be watching you on Facebook also. 1001 people will be watching you on Facebook.
Yeah. How did you reach this magical figure? How did you reach this magical figure?
By evening, you will see, by night, Arabian nights, you will see 1001 will have been crossed.
It's 3:30. Can we?
No,
please?
As I said, you know, very few people in Delhi University know me.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I have hardly, you know, I've hardly visited DU, you know. My
Yeah,
space
good.
has been Jamia and JNU.
Okay,
So
we are
probably in my
starting
22 years of teaching, I'm coming. Yeah, in my 22 years of teaching, this is the second time I'm coming, you know.
Yeah.
So
Thank you,
to
Ranjeeta.
speak.
Ranjeeta, can we start now,
Yeah.
please?
Sure, please. Sure.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Department of History, University of Delhi, I welcome you to a webinar with Professor Ranjeeta Dutta. Professor Ranjeeta Dutta teaches at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her areas of interest are history of religion and ideas of region and spatialities in medieval and early modern India. She has been a fellow at Max Weber Kolleg, University of Erfurt, Germany, and at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Her publications, in addition to her essays in journals and edited volumes, include a monograph titled From Hagiographies to Biographies Ramanuja in Tradition and History, an edited special issue of Summerhill titled Regions, Identities and Entangled Geographies, and a co-edited volume titled Negotiating Religion, Perspectives from Indian History. Professor Dutta is currently a member of the editorial collective of the Medieval History Journal. I will now invite ma'am to begin her talk, but before that, we request everyone to kindly keep their microphones muted while the speaker is presenting, although you may leave your videos on if you wish, and questions will be taken after the talk. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, Srijani. A very good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining this lecture. I'm grateful to the organizers, Professor Shaleen Jain, Professor Aziuddin Akil, and Professor Seema Bawa, the head of the Department of History at Delhi University. A very big thanks to the student organizers of this event, Srijani Pia and Ashu, I think, if I can recollect his name. Now, let me begin with an apology first. This is because where I live, there are power cuts at times, and we are on an online mode. So if such a mishap happens, then please bear with me. However, let me assure you that there's a generator backup in my housing society, and if the electricity is disconnected, it will be restored within 5 to 7 minutes. So I just thought, you know, to save myself from, more embarrassment, I should sort of lay this caveat before I begin my talk. Now, this paper is a part of an ongoing project on religion and urbanity in Srirangam in early modern period. This idea of, this particular theme of religion and urbanity came, I got involved with this theme when I was offered a fellowship, at Max Weber Kolleg at the University of Erfurt in Germany, where two scholars who have been engaging with this, Professor Susanna Rao and Professor Jörg Rübke, sort of were very kind enough to pull me into it and work on it. And it is then when I started working that I realized the possibilities of exploring various facets of medieval and early modern urbanization. Now, the larger framework, of the paper and of this work involves the various ways in which cities and religion interact as they develop. That is how religion influences the urban life, the characteristic of urban, and is involved in the production of city spaces. Now, there are works on the cities and religion in the modern period, which have always studied the ways in which the urban landscape and religious practices and ideas influence each other, like that of Smriti Srinivasan on Bangalore, Yamini Narayanan on Jaipur, Tapati Guha Thakurda on Durga Puja in Calcutta, Peter van der Veer on Ayodhya, and also Madhuri Desai on Banaras. However, there are very few works, or hardly any, where medieval or early modern period of Indian history is concerned, which deal with the interstices of religion and urbanity, except the work of Professor R. Champak Lakshmi. But even in that work, it is the material context which takes precedence, and that is also till the 14th century. Now, in most cases, religion and economic context in the city space are studied in a disjointed way, with separate trajectories of development. Now, there are some recent works in a form of collection of essays, namely the one edited by Supriya Chaudhary on religion and urbanity, in which Razi and I both have a contribution. And the another one is, of course, Malvika Kasturi's essay on Nath Yogis and city of Gorakhpur in Narayani Gupta and Partho Datta's edited book on urban spaces. Now, what I've attempted in this presentation is to analyze the interaction between religion and urbanity from a spatial perspective, in which spaces are linked to conflicts and negotiations between inclusion and exclusion. And in this conflict and negotiations, relations of power and authority are very crucial. The space to be studied is, of course, the temple town of, Sri Rangam. I'm sorry, but how do I move the slide? Is the temple town of Sri Rangam, and it is located on an island on River Kaveri in Tiruchirappalli, with two temples. One is Jambukeshwaram, belonging to the Shaiva tradition, and second is the gigantic domineering temple of Ranganatha Swami, belonging to the Sri Vaishnava tradition. So this is River Kaveri, and this is here you have Sri Rangam, which is located here. Now, in fact, such temples in urban spaces have made Patrick Geddes, the famous Scottish town planner, at the beginning of the 20th century, call them as temple towns or temple cities, a term I'm not very comfortable with, though I have used it in the title of my paper today. The reason is that it pre-decides for us how to view a place. And over a period of time, it typifies it essentially, because people living in those towns, at least in the historical past, did not see it as a temple town exclusively. That is why most of the works on Sri Rangam treat it as an exclusively sacred town within the frame of bhakti, a pilgrimage city, and discuss the architecture of the temple of Ranganath, dedicated to Vishnu mainly, temple festivals, and the religious activities of the Sri Vaishnava community, which is a religious tradition there, including the activities of the famous medieval saint Ramanuja, who lived there in the 12th century. Now, all these themes give us an impression that it was just sacrality that was the flavor of the town, or that was the characteristic of the town, and dominated the urban life. Now, while acknowledging the relevance of these studies and also adding to them in my own writings, while I was working on this theme, the question that kept coming to my mind was that what were the ways in which various social groups, especially the marginalized sections, negotiated with the urban space, and how did they claim it? To loosely borrow the concept from Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey's The Right to the City, And of course, the concept of the right to the city, its application is for very modern times in relation to capital and capitalism dominating the city, and various urban movements led by marginalized groups struggling to claim their rights to live in it. So I have been sort of loosely, inspired by that context, and I feel that such a study can become relevant for towns like Srirangam, where religion played a very important role in the production of the urban space. But at the same time, you also have an urban life which was far beyond the religious leaders, which involved various other social groups. And how did they interact, or how did they make a space for themselves in this town? So in this presentation, I, try to, look at the crafts and craftsmen, and I try to analyze the interaction between religion and urbanity, which I feel can also be better understood through the prism of craft production, craftsmen, and its sustainability. That is, from a position of a marginal group, the craftsmen asserted themselves and influenced the urban space. And religion played a very important role in the articulation. It played a transformative role in this case. Thus, the temple was the public presence of, both the craftsmen as well as the religious leaders, and was not only the material force, but also a symbolic power representing the ways in which religion, articulates itself in an urban space. Now, I admit that in the case of medieval period, particularly from the 14th century onwards, and even before that, it is difficult to undertake such a venture due to the nature of sources. The sources usually which are used to study Srirangam, or for that matter, any part of the town or urbanization in South India, are inscriptions, hagiographies, and temple chronicles. However, it needs to be remembered that both epigraphical engravings and textual productions presented a certain kind of power, authority, and control of knowledge. The inscriptions, and there are over 800 of them, inscribed on the granite wall of the temple buildings, issued by temple authorities, ruling groups, and state, are definitely language of power. And they bear the names of rulers and the grants, etc. Similarly, hagiographies and temple chronicles, one of them being a very famous one called Koilologu, were authored by Brahmins, and in more than one ways reflected a Brahminical worldview. So attempts to recover the voice of craftsmen from these sources, and these are the only sources, is not an easy task, at least in the case of Srirangam. So the way, when I present here, my thesis, you might find, sometimes there is a certain disjointed, sort of flow, which would obviously be because of the nature of sources that we have. Although late Vijayarama Swami and before that Mira Abraham have done excellent work, documented really well on crafts and craftsmen, but somehow to locate it in a micro study, and in this case in Srirangam, is something which has not been attempted till so far, or if they have been, I would like to be corrected. Now, I would be discussing 5 themes. The first theme will be a brief discussion of the town of Srirangam. The second theme will discuss the nature of ritual items and the context of their use and circulation of craft goods. The third theme will focus upon the historical processes of economic production and consumption, patterns of the temple, and the town and the relation of craftsmen, artisans, and traders with the temple. That was the nerve center of the town, and discuss certain aspects related to craftsmen and their status in the society. The fourth theme will highlight the relation of various religious groups. And I will be focusing actually on the Sri Vaishnava community, because there is a Shaiva community also. But the research on that is still awaited. And I would be also discussing only one temple, which is the Ranganatha Swami temple. And I also tell you why this is so, apart from the practical aspects. What is very important is that what were the equal spaces that existed, which were ritual and administrative, And was this the notion of equality or equal spaces just symbolic and real? Now, the fifth theme will discuss the ways in which streets and dwellings were arranged as differential spaces determined by relationships of hierarchy and control. So let me just begin, with the first part, which is about Srirangam. It is situated in the district of Tiruchirappalli, which I had, just sort of spoken about. It is an island town surrounded by river Kaveri and Koladam. We find that the settlement of Srirangam actually has two temples, Ranganatha Swami, dedicated to Vishnu, and Jambukeshwaram temple dedicated to Shiva. Both the temples are important pilgrimage centers of the Sri Vaishnava and the Shaiva communities, respectively, today, and have an antiquated past dating approximately to 2000 years ago. Now, I focus, as I just said, on Ranganatha Swami temple. This is because the temple that, which is dominated the urban landscape of Srirangam because of its height, scale, and its unique structural layout. In the slide, in the PowerPoint, these are the temple gateways, and these are really high. All right. In fact, also what is important is that the temple is synonymous with the town, and the study of Srirangam usually has revolved around the temple and its adjoining settlement. In addition, the history and urban planning of both the temple and town is inextricably linked with the history of the Sri Vaishnava religious community and its traditions. In fact, both Ranganatha Swami temple and Jambukeshwaram temple are actually very important pilgrimage sites for both Sri Vaishnava and, of course, the Shaivas. Now, coming back to, of course, the Ranganatha Swami temple, the temple complex is, of course, 156 acres with a perimeter of 1,116 kilometers. And what is interesting is that it comprises of 7 rectangular concentric walls, which I'll see. These are the 7 rectangular concentric walls, and each of these walls are called prakaras, and there are 4 gateways or gopurams along each prakara forming an axial path. Now, around the original temple precincts, there were 3 concentric wall enclosures, but gradually the city expanded and 4 more concentric walls were added. The lateral boundaries pushed to the main highway in the west and dense forest in the east. The largest gopuram is the first wall, on the southern side, and it was completed as recently as 1987, and now it measures 73 meters high. Nearly whole of the town and its settlements, with its complex urban life, are located within the 7 prakaras. And as I said before, the temple and the town are almost synonymous with each other, blurring the distinction between the sacred, and the secular. Now, Jambukeshwaram temple, built in the southeast to Srirangam, is also large in its proportion and dimensions, but it has only 1 walled enclosure street with a cluster of settlements outside the wall. Similarly, we have such walled enclosures in Madurai and Chidambaram, which are quite similar to Srirangam in urban planning and conception, but they have only 4 or 5 enclosures, respectively, and sometimes the settlements are outside the temples. Now, in the case of Srirangam, the entire town seems to be located within these 7 walls of the temple complex. So this is the description about, the city itself. Now I come to the second part, where I try to talk about the craft, and the craft production. And I would like to highlight that it has been one of the most vibrant part of the cities or the towns, not only economic, but also social life. And one of the persistent features of epigraphical and textual accounts at Srirangam is the documentation of continuous construction and repair of various structures inside and around the Ranganatha Swami temple, especially of the 7 walls that surrounded it. Now, the temple chronicle called Olugu, that was compiled around the 16th century, begins with the description of the morphology of the urban space of Srirangam, listing the names of the 7 walls, and then at length describing the construction and repair of various structures within the temple complex. The Olugu informs that these building activities were mostly sponsored by the political and religious elites, and provides us with their names and respective contributions. In such a context, we cannot miss the connection that there would have been hectic artisanal activities, particularly of masons and stonecutters. In addition to construction and repair work, the masons and stonecutters would also be involved in inscribing numerous records on the stone walls of the temple. Inscriptional records contain frequent references to sthapatis or architects receiving orders and being awarded with land grants and house sites, especially from 14th century onwards. Thus, we can determine from the inscription the proliferation of festival celebrations, ritual procedures, which with greater vigor, it's not that it was not there before, but with greater vigor from the 14th and 15th century onwards. These activities, along with the orientation of the Sri Vaishnava community identity, provided the context for the use of ritual objects like vessels, lampstands, parasols, horses, chariots, pots, flagstaffs, fly whisks, palanquins, and whole lot jewelries, all mostly made of gold, silver, and precious stones, brass and bronze lamp, gold crown studded with pearls and rubies for the god, and so on. As ritual activities gradually grew, the use and the functions of these ritual objects also increased and became complex. For instance, between the 10th and the 13th century, the number of inscriptions referring to gold and silver vessels, lampstands, lamps, fly wicks, and so on are few, but they increased significantly from 14th century, and new ritual objects are added, like the palanquins, jewelries studded with precious stones. Now, most of these objects can easily be titled as craft goods because they required skilled and specialized knowledge of techniques and technology. I mean, these were the prerequisites of their production. Further, the production of these goods was numerous as they catered to a large clientele, of these objects. And we find that clearly the production, of these objects required skilled artisans, goldsmiths, silversmiths, and, we have temple records providing ample evidence of all these craftsmen and artisans in the town itself. Now, these ritual craft goods were usually donated as gifts by royal groups, landlords, chieftains, mercantile communities, religious leaders, and sometimes ordinary individuals to the main deity or to an influential religious leader on the occasion of the celebration of festivals and birthdays of the donor, or even simply due to devotion. In exchange, the political and the economic elites received honors, and their status of power and authority were enhanced. It was legitimized, and they were given high-sounding titles and composition of, fanciful genealogies, on their behalf was attempted by the Brahmins in the temple. In fact, we find that such donations and gifts were not exclusive only to the Ranganatha temple at Sri Rangam. In fact, the entire Tamil region, which large temple complexes like at Madurai, Chidambaram, Tanjavur, they evince such patronage and beneficiary activities. Therefore, religious activities and the desire for legitimation through gifting provided the basis for the sustainable use of these objects over many centuries. Further, sustainability was made tenable and secure as the political and mercantile elites and the temple remained primary consumers of these high-value ritual objects. The presence of a fairly large group of merchants chettis in the town of Srirangam. Making donations indicate a well-developed exchange and market network and a redistributive system. Now, with the substantiation of high-value crafts in circulation, how does one account for the lack of evidence, both inscriptional and textual, in relation to potters and blacksmiths? Somehow reference to potters and blacksmiths who were crafting, and I'm sure they were crafting items of everyday use. In fact, I don't think the town of Srirangam talks anywhere of the location of the potter's wheel. Perhaps, through corroboration of sources, the answer can be sought from the data on the growth of town from 11th century onwards, and the presence of Srirangam as an urban sacred space with hectic commercial and religious activities was dependent on the continuous expansion of its rural hinterland. And it is in this rural hinterland that potters and blacksmiths would have been located. And a large part of this rural hinterland used to be informal spaces, which were gradually formalized by the town by incorporating them into the spaces of the town. So with the integration and with the extension and integration of various peasant settlements in the river valleys, the temple, town, and the rural areas, they all got linked to each other. And hence there would have been, and there was bound to be, exchange of craft goods and skills between the town and the hinterland, and they would have influenced each other. Such an interaction also illustrated the existence of a specialized crafts production, with craftsmen in towns and villages dependent on each other for raw material, finished artifacts, and also food grains from the agriculturists. The possibilities of networks of markets and nodal points of exchange can further be highlighted with the increasing presence of merchants in this area and also in the rural hinterland. We have inscriptions talking about chettis granting land located in the villages, indicating their movement and circulation of commodity. The urban-rural interaction is extensively documented, particularly from the 14th century, with the continuous expansion of hinterland and the movement of various people from the town to the hinterland. In fact, the temple records and inscriptions clearly depict the change in the routes undertaken by religious processions during the occasion of celebration of various festivals, covering newly appropriated integrated areas of the hinterland with the city itself. Now, most of the villages gifted, bought, and sold were also located, in nearby areas and little far away, all drained by the river Kaveri and the wet and the fertile region. Now, in the 14th century, with the Pandya occupation of the Kaveri Delta, we find that the hinterland expanded and included regions closer to Madurai, and it brought in not only the urban and the rural elites, but also in large number the pastoral communities, the shepherd communities, who also were making grants of land and ritual items like lamps, camphor, and oil. Therefore, the consumer base of ritual objects for which the evidence is forthcoming, and the objects of everyday use for which evidence is indirect, expanded with the expansion of the hinterland, with the integration of the hinterland and the exchange of the rural-urban networks. So we find that this economy of circulation and redistribution became the basis of economic exchange. And hence, as I said before, it was a specialized craft production of various goods. And these goods were actually prestige items whose use and context gave power and authority to political and religious groups as consumers. And this perhaps provided the sustainability of continuous production. Now, after I have sort of quickly outlined, the dynamism of the crafts production in forms of ritual items in the town of Srirangam. Now, let us look at, how the craft community or the craftsmen sort of asserted themselves, or what was their relationship vis-a-vis the town as well as the temple. Perhaps one of the crucial elements of sustainability of craft production was the relationship between the producer and the consumer, and the consequent status of the craftsman. And I cite a particular incident from the inscriptions, which is as follows. The year was 1080, and the place was a temple in Brahmadeya called Raj Mahendra Chaturvedi Mangalam. And Raj Mahendra Chaturvedi Mangalam, Brahmadeya, which is a Brahmin village, which was a part of the hinterland of the Ranganatha temple at Sri Rangam. Now, in this particular village, that is in this particular Brahmadeya, there was a severe conflict between the right hand and left hand castes to which the craftsmen and artisans belonged to in the village. The property of the temple was vandalized, as we are told by the inscription, and its treasury looted, and the temple was unable to safeguard it. The temple administration at Sri Rangam, as a compensation, we are further informed, gave a certain lump sum and exempted certain lands belonging to the temple in the Brahmadeya from payment of taxes. So they were exempted from the payment of taxes. Now this is recorded in an inscription on the fourth wall, at Sri Rangam, that is the fourth enclosure of Sri Rangam. And it should be noted that the fourth enclosure comprised dwellings and settlements which mostly belong to artisans and craftsmen. So it was clearly for their consumption. We have another record dated around 12th century inscribed on the walls of the same fourth enclosure. And that inscription informs us that a certain individual artisan, who is also a very important artisan, he's a leader of the community, and he's called Kaikola Mudali. Kaikola is, of course, an artisanal community. Mudali is leader. And we are told that this particular artisan would take an oath of loyalty unto death as a servant to a certain chieftain of the village. So though he's a leader of the weavers, and he's like a master craftsman, and it seemed he had several looms and weavers under his supervision, but his taking of the oath of loyalty somehow tells us that the position of the craftsman was very subordinate in this period. That is, the entire weaving community, because Kaikolas are a weaving community, was also tied to the control and domination of the chieftains. Now, from these epigraphs, it appears that artisans and craftsmen were definitely subordinate and seemed to be in bondage despite some kind of a corporate identity. Now, the context of organization of production, social and economic status of the craftsmen, and relations between consumers and producers also determines the sustainability of crafts goods and their production. The state, landlords, chieftains, and temples might have controlled the artisan and craftsmen, definitely by extracting taxes, by imposing levies on them, which was a good source of income. And we have several cases which tell us that, in fact, the temple played a very significant role in the collection of these taxes. And it also employed artisans and craftsmen. And often we find that the craftsmen resisted. What they perceived was an excessive control. And they threatened to leave the village or town and migrate. However, it is not clear whether the state and the temples organized, regulated, and controlled the process of production, deciding what and how much was to be produced. The corporate mercantile bodies and occupationally defined social groups, it seemed, controlled the production process, and the relationship of craftsmen with the temple and the state did not involve the state or the temple trying to control the production process. So the production process was in the hands of the craftsmen, though their status in the city and the hinterland was subordinate and seemed to be practically in bondage. And this is the condition which we find till the 14th century. Now, the status of craftsmen appear to have improved by the 14th century. This is because of extensive urbanization, commercialization, expansion of trade and trading networks, which happened mostly due to the patronage of the Vijayanagar rulers and the elites. And we also find that amidst so much of commercialization, the bargaining position of the craftsmen improved. And inscriptions tell us that. And I'll be just telling you how. Now, in all these inscriptions, the craftsmen are referred to as either Rathkaras or Kamalars. Now, these are terms which are collectively for goldsmith and silversmiths, along with which we have references of masons, carpenters, and architects living in the streets surrounding the temple. There are engravings of chisels, hammers, and knives on the walls, which is some kind of a signature or an artisanal mark. And it probably in many ways showed an identity, an independent identity of the craftsmen. And the fact that chisels, hammers, and knives were their signatures. Also to tell us that craftsmen had a certain control over the means or techniques of production. And they could independently render service to the temple and political patrons from time to time. Now, this is, of course, from the 14th century. Now, this independent status, it appears, was also coupled with the assertion of corporate identities of these craftsmen as an occupational group. And from 14th century, it is this corporate identity that empowered the craftsmen tremendously. I'll talk of a particular inscription to give you an example of the 14th century, where the craftsmen had a temple of their own, which was called Rathakara Vinnagar, and it had its own land base. And this temple was controlled by the craftsmen themselves of Srirangam. Now, we are told that these craftsmen regularly received often gifts from merchants as well as from political elites of land mainly, and this further expanded the landed base of this temple. We have another example of an inscription dated to 15th century, which tell us that 98 groups of artisans and 98 groups of peasants came together and resolved that they would not pay the taxes to the Brahmanas and the Velalas, who are a powerful landed community of landlords. According to them, the reason why they are not paying is that these taxes were imposed unjustly over them. Hence, they will defy the army, the governor, and the state. This is a very strongly worded, resistance. Further, the inscription tells us that they decided that if anyone amongst them changed sides, this is very interesting, they would be degraded in the caste hierarchy. Now, the independent and the corporate identities of the craftsmen were not, in contradiction with each other. This is evident in the inscriptional records of the 16th century. The same inscription, while informing us about the repair work done by an independent individual craftsman, whose name is also given, also refers to Rathkaras and their marks of chisel, hammer, and knives inscribed on the stone slab. In the 16th century, on the temple walls of the Ranganatha temple, the masons working on a set of stone sculptures decided to leave their identities behind on the temple walls after their work was over. Now, having an inscription engraved would require the permission of temple authorities and the state administration. Not perhaps willing to engage with either of them, the masons decided to engrave chisels and hammers and their individual signatures on the wall, thus in many ways trying to subvert an anonymous heritage which they were anyway always consigned to. Perhaps by the 16th century, the craftsmen had emerged as a confident group, and it was a sign of power and assertion of identity to have engraved these marks. The assertion of individual as well as corporate identities evident in the marks, engraved on the walls, was also emphasized further in an inscriptional record when, as a body, 5 artisanal classes in Srirangam demanded a redressal for their grievances and threatened to migrate if their cause was not addressed. Now, this inscription records that the state gave them some assurance and, and so that they did not, emigrate or leave Srirangam. Since, we've just stated that the state and the institutions of the state, like the temples, hardly controlled the process of production. The agency of the craftsman often determined the production of the craft goods as well as its sustainability. Now, this agency was undoubtedly context sensitive and was determined by the nature of demand and consumption. There are many consumers and patrons for craft goods, especially those goods which symbolized prestige, and their commercial circulation and exchange gave craftsmen economic power to assert and find opportunities for social mobility. And it is here that we have religion coming in, which the temple and the Sri Vaishnava religious tradition at Sri Rangam provided avenues of such an upward social mobility. Fourth theme of my presentation, which talks about the concept of equal access, in the religion, and how that influenced the urbanity, and how this particular religion of Sri Vaishnavas, which had its antecedents in the bhakti ideas of the Alvars, actually is influenced by the developments and the assertion of the craftsmen and other non-Brahmana groups at Sri Rangam. And in the medieval period, that is from 14th century onwards, it definitely appears more like an urban religion. Now, the assertion of caste grouping at Sri Rangam was evident, with the mercantile and artisanal groups clearly stating in the inscriptions that their identities as Trivarnika. Trivarnika is the third caste, and it is, and these kind of claims are being made that the Trivarnika or the third caste is superior, and their social status is very relevant within the town and the temple spaces. Now, it needs to be emphasized that the rise of the non-Brahmin landed class, emergence of merchants, the migration of warriors and landed magnates to Sri Rangam from 14th century onwards, definitely created a certain kind of a social change. And in this rise of the non-Brahmin elites, landed communities and warriors, we can also add craftsmen, master craftsmen, and artisans. So there is a social ferment, particularly from the 14th century onwards, and this would definitely influence the religious traditions of Shaivism as well as Sri Vaishnavism. In the case of Jambukeshwaram temple, the temple text, which kind of came up in the 15th, 16th century, talks about the construction of the temple wall by Shiva with the help of laborers, and it names the laboring communities. All right, which shows that when they are figuring in the records and they are being named, it shows that there is a certain kind of a significance, importance which is being attributed to them. So clearly, a large number of these political and economic elites, of which there would be some craftsmen, they were powerful and influential, and they emerged as major benefactors of the temple. And hence, they also became patrons of the Sri Vaishnava religious leaders. A network of redistribution and exchange between the non-Brahmin and Brahmin elite groups developed, and we find that it brought temple arena into the ambit of the non-Brahmina participation. So the temple as a public space definitely expanded with the patronage of these new groups which was coming up during this period. Now, obviously, such an interaction would influence the religious discourse of the Sri Vaishnava community, and we find that most of the Sri Vaishnava hagiographies and religious practices, which have their genesis in Sri Rangam, which developed in Sri Rangam and then spread all over, was actually influenced, by, these changes. And the Sri Vaishnava religious leaders, the acharyas, who were mostly Brahmins, had several non-Brahmana followers, and they figured very prominently in the temple activities and participated in the ritual activities, which otherwise the access to the temple and its ritual activities would have been difficult. Now, in the 15th century, for example, a Shudra Sri Vaishnava leader, whose name is Kandadai Ramanuja Dasar, held an influential position in the temple at Sri Rangam. Therefore, it's very clear that the social base of the Sri Vaishnavas expanded, and the temple emerged as an arena for craftsmen and other non-Brahmana groups to articulate and fulfill their social and religious aspirations. Sometimes, in addition to ritual privileges, there were also other privileges which were conferred upon them. For instance, appointments as accountants, temple managers, trustees, and treasurers. Therefore, different orders with distinct lineages emerged within the religious community in the town. And what we find is a large-scale interaction between the Brahmin and the non-Brahmana communities in important activities of the town itself. In fact, what is recorded in the hagiographies and the religious texts is the fact that all these acharyas had a large following from all sections of the society, which included Brahmanas who are ascetics, that is sannyasis, non-Brahmana sannyasis also, who are called ekangis, women followers, chieftains, temple trustees, servants, guards, and a very important group which keeps figuring is, of course, the Shatada Sri Vaishnavas. These Shatada Sri Vaishnavas were actually a Shudra group, and they were actually renunciates, and they figured in the temple very prominently. According to the tradition, the Shatadas were previously Brahmins. The tradition says that they were previously Brahmins who had renounced the sacred thread, removed their top knot, and stopped performing Vedic rites in favor of temple services. And they became renunciates. And because they became renunciates, they of an ordinary Shudra did not apply to them. They had to follow the rules of their respective acharyas. So this is how we see, the non-Brahmin groups becoming very active in the space of the temple. However, let us not feel too euphoric about this kind of, participation, because it's very important to analyze that what were the ritual spaces which were granted to these non-Brahmana groups. They were granted shares in the temple offerings. They participated in ritual singing of the hymns. They prepared the sandal paste, turmeric, and fruits. They picked up fruits. They organized various offerings like cloth, areca nut, and so on. So you should see that none of these services were directed towards, worship and performing rituals in the sanctum sanctorum, which had closed. The sanctum sanctorum is where the god was there, and it involved close proximity to the god, often touching the image. So it is here, it is in this particular space that we do not find any of these Shudra non-Brahmanas participating. In fact, these activities in this particular space was performed exclusively by the Brahmins. So the status, has enhanced, but there are certain limitations to it. Interestingly, the inscriptions, while on one hand talk about the rise of the craftsmen and the assertion of their bargaining power, it also tells us that by 16th century, the status of the Shatadas particularly, declined, and there is hardly any reference to their administrative involvement in the temple. In fact, most of the positions which they held now went to the Brahmins. In fact, Koilolugu, which is a chronicle I've just talked about of the Ranganatha Swami temple at Sri Rangam, compiled, in the 16th century, also documents 17th and 18th century aspects, very clearly tells us that the non-Brahmanas or the Shudras were not accorded any ritual duties, rather they functioned as ordinary temple servants. Now I come to the last part of my presentation, which is, of course, about the spatial layout of the city. How did all these changes, sort of influence the spatial layout of the city? Now, from the location of various inscriptions in the town, it can be assumed that, if one takes a walk, if one walked progressively from the last enclosure, this is parts of the city, one would have come across, it you're bound to come across, material structures of religion in the form of small shrines, middle-sized temples, and pillared pavilions. Further, if one would have climbed atop these high temple towers, these are really high, located all over the city, one would have got an increasingly clearer view of the temple. And the sharpest view is from the towers of the second enclosure. And when these gateways are built, when these gopurams are built, they're so high, if you can see here, it's very clear that there is an attempt to regulate the city space and the public space of the city. And who was regulating it is another theme of research. One would, of course, like to believe that the state and the temple regulated it, but one cannot ignore the fact that this regulation of the public space would be done in negotiation with the other social groups of the city life. We have a very interesting article by Susanna Rao about the taverns in the French town of Lyon in the early modern period, where she's talking about the regulating of those spaces in negotiation with the city people and the town administration, and the conflict that emerges thereafter. Now, around the temple, in this case, there were horizontal stratifications of residential area and a ceremonial center so designed and built that the city was spatially aligned symbolically to the cosmic nature and forces. The elites primarily belonged to priests, ruling groups, landed and administrative classes lived in the second and the third enclosures. The first one is, of course, the temple itself. And occupational groups like weavers, dyes, and mixed castes had residential settlements at the outer premises of the temple from the fourth enclosure onwards. Therefore, by the time you reach the last enclosure, which is the seventh enclosure, of the Ranganatha Swami temple, these were settlements which were occupied by the servants of the temple, devotees, and later on also by artisans and tradesmen who provided the inhabitants not so much with ritual goods, but with necessities of daily life. Thus, the social status determined the proximity of the residents to the temple. This social demarcation of space exists till today, and it is important to analyze the changes which would have taken place in the modern context. Now, from the inscriptions, it is evident that by the 14th century, 5 walled enclosures were already built to accommodate the growing population of Srirangam. Until the end of the 13th century, we find that the inscriptions in the first 3 enclosures, that is the temple and the 2 enclosures where you have the elites, the walls are recording or documenting mostly land grants, the donors of which naturally belong to ruling lineages and powerful political groups. A large number of records also were royal orders here in these walls regarding the genealogies of the rulers, their benefactions, and administrative orders. The fourth street very clearly had records, which addressed the artisans, peasants, and craftsmen as the audience. However, by the beginning of the 14th century, now this is still the 13th century, this demarcation is made. Now, by the 14th century, a change is clearly visible. And we find that there is a certain crossover the artisans and the craftsmen have made because of their bargaining power. So we find them, in the inscriptions. We find references of them in the inscriptions in a significant way where land and money transaction is concerned in the third wall, in the third enclosure, which was meant for the elites. And here we find that they are part of administrative decisions. So interestingly, in the fourth enclosure, there are a set of inscriptions that document the grant of land for new housing sites to a group of Brahmins and settlements of new villages. Probably the certification of such administrative orders related to the Brahminical settlements, settlement patterns in the fourth street was to inform the artisans and craftsmen about the opportunities of possible activities in these new areas, implying that the services was needed there. Thus, in the 13th and the 14th centuries, the social status did not appear to be defining the demographic distribution in the walled streets. And there's a certain kind of a heterogeneity. Now, as I said, this was a period where you see a lot of change. And, the situation changed further in the 15th and the 16th century, where you have both the artisans, craftsmen, and the religious groups getting mixed up in their residences in the third, fourth, and the fifth inclusion. We find that there is an expansion of ritual and festival activities in which these groups participated. However, inside the temple complex, we find that their participation was decreasing by the 16th and the 17th century. So to conclude, this paper very in a very breezy way, based on difficult evidence, attempted to examine how the city and the temple, which were morphologically synonymous with each other, provided on one hand spaces of power and hierarchy, on the other hand provided spaces of liberation and equality also. Were these spaces of equal access really equal? Did they lead to dissolution of hierarchies? These are questions which we have to, engage with. The ways in which temple provided an arena for upward caste mobility emphasizes that while the production of space also leads to the production of inequalities, power, and control, it can also provide spaces of liberation and social mobility, but in a limited way. Thus, the historical processes of religion and urbanity in Srirangam and provided the basis of relations of social dominance, which were influenced by caste, occupational hierarchies, and ritual rankings of the social groups, and produced spaces which were equal as well as unequal at the same time. Now, further research is required to explore the constant process of interpreting and redefining of spaces. For such a study is useful to understand the dynamism of spatialities and the role of historical actors in this in it. The idea that spaces of all kinds, whether it be the city space, the sacred space, are always open to contestations and competitive control, is very much reflected in Srirangam. And of course, this requires further research. Whatever may be the complex nature of unequal spaces and equal access, the delineation of Srirangam, the temple, the religious leaders, and ideologies representing a broad social outlook became the vibrant manifestations of religion and urbanity of that particular town. So I stop here, and thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to me. Thank you. This is, of course, the temple. This is the Jambukeshwaram temple. These are the inscriptions. Yeah.
So thank you, ma'am. Do we have any questions or comments?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
ma'am,
you
for
are.
your very interesting lecture. So even my MPhil research is very closely connected to the themes that you discussed today. So therein I'm discussing about the I've attempted to redefine Banaras and move away from the imagery of a temple city, wherein I've engaged with a quote unquote minority community, which is the Jains. And I've traced how they were building temples, expanding the status of Banaras as a pilgrimage city, and how all of this was linked to the commercial importance of the town itself. So, in that context, I was wondering who was patronizing the Ranganatha and the adjoining temples in Srirangapatnam, and what was the role of merchant guilds in this temple network? Since we're talking about urbanity, I thought this would be
Yeah,
an important thing.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
there's also another question, if you permit.
yeah, yeah, sure,
Uh,
please. Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I've struggled in my research is that when we are deconstructing towns like the temple cities, and we are using categories like urban. So, like, what conceptual categories can be used other than urban or composite? I mean, can we also look at cosmopolitanism and attribute this terminology to these cities, considering that there were interactions happening between political powers, merchants, craftsmen, and even other social communities? Uh, so that's about it. Thank you.
Mm, yeah, thank you, Aditi. Should I take all questions together or should I address them individually?
As you wish, ma'am, according to your convenience.
Okay, let me address Aditi's question. Aditi, the patronage is varied. It's coming from various sections of the society. Of course, to say that it is only coming from the elites is also not correct. We also find lots and lots, and in the case of Sri Rangam, I'll talk about it, lots and lots of gifts and patronage coming from the shepherd community, the pastoral communities, and these pastoral communities were also warrior communities. You have, of course, merchants. You also have, interestingly, craftsmen don't patronize so much this particular temple. They patronize more their own temple, which is there in Sri Rangam, which is the Rathakara Vinnakar. But there's no doubt about the fact that the patronage is varied, and merchants, shepherds, women, of course, but the women are from the royal houses. They are not ordinary, women. They and the rulers and the chieftains, mostly the chieftains, large number of chieftains are the ones who are actually patronizing the temple. All right. So that is very crucial for us because we have to see who these chieftains are, who these social groups are. Were they before? And where are they coming from? And normally in these inscriptions you sort of are given a certain kind of information about their provenance, about their about their places of origin. And we find a lot of them have migrated from the northern frontiers, which is the Telugu region. So that and hence you find there is a strong assertion and enhancement of influence of the non-Brahmana groups, which also continues even after the Vijayanagar Empire declines. In fact, Sanjay Subramaniam, David Schulman and Velacheru Narayan Rao in their symbols of substance talk about the fact that it is the Shudra pedigree now which is upheld. That is considered to be the actual royal pedigree and not the Brahminical pedigree, which takes a backspace. And you see the not only the beginnings, but also certain parts of it, even at Sri Rangam, when there is a constant assertion of these groups all the time, with which the religious leaders who are primarily Brahmins are dealing with. So this is one part, because patronage would just not mean who's sponsoring. Patronage also would mean that why they're sponsoring and how they are negotiating. That is one aspect. Second aspect about using the word cosmopolitanism. Why should we use this word cosmopolitanism? Cosmopolitanism versus what? Is against what? Is something we have to think about before we use this word cosmopolitanism. Why do we have this pressure on us to describe these spaces or these towns or these cities, including Banaras, as a cosmopolitan place? So we have to think before we apply these terms. That is what I would say. I would hesitate to use any such term or categories that essentializes these towns. I am not much in favor of the word temple town, because you see, people also then start thinking about it in that way. And today, the residents of Sri Rangam, when you talk to them, they don't particularly think it's a temple town. In fact, they are, when I went there and I visited, I was myself, my own stereotypes were challenged because I thought everybody would be praying and, will be immersed in prayers. But they are highly secular jobs. They move to Trichy, the nearby town. They are IT engineers. They are, all kinds of people who are, in construction activities. And yet, if they have the time, they visit the temple. It is actually the NRIs, if I have to say, and of course, people who live outside Sri Rangam have this romantic vision of Sri Rangam, which is there about what they thought was back in time. So they want to freeze that image. So the category of temple town, heritage town fits very well that romantic perception. All right. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
If anybody has any doubts, questions,
I
please.
have a question. If
Yeah,
there is
sure,
time,
ma'am.
then I would like
Yes,
to ask.
ma'am, please. Go.
Yeah. Ranjita, thank you for that talk. I just want to clarify that I understood this right, that there are two kinds of, spatial difference in terms of access. One is the presence. So the prakaras. So fourth prakara onwards, you have this kind of differential access of people to the next prakara, and similarly in the temple itself. Is that how it is?
Yes, it is. In fact, you
yeah.
see, till the 13th century, 14th century, the access is not very, it's there, but it's not, so easy. But from the 14th century, there is a mix, and we find that the social exclusivity to some of these prakaras is now getting blurred. That is what I meant. And
Why would that blurring happen? Where do you place that blurring? That's especially given the religious and rituals, especially ritual that is involved.
Yeah, I place that blurring in the, in the fact that, the various social groups, and of course, I'm talking about the craftsmen, but there are other social groups also, they are becoming more and more assertive and have in many ways, because their economic bargaining power is increased and they're playing a very important role in the economy of the town. You see, they are being more and more, assertive about, the kind of spaces which were denied to them, and and demanding access, and they're getting access, and that's why this blurring is happening, and but interestingly, while around the settlement patterns, which is from the 3rd Street onwards till the 17th Street, this blurring keeps taking place. Within the temple precincts, inside the temple, it is becoming more and more distinct. So you have, there was a time when the non-Brahmins had a lot of role to play in the temple ritual activities, but from the 16th century, there seems to be a very, very visible decline, and they're just reduced to the status of temple servants. So you see, these two kind of things happening at the same time. Yeah.
Within this particularly, do we hear of the Devadasis as a separate category who have certain differential access?
I'm afraid, since I don't work on the Devdasis, and there are inscriptions which do talk of Devdasis, but there aren't many, which talk of the Devdasi cult, Devdasi system, but there are references to musicians, and musicians in large numbers. In fact, the instruments of the musicians, which instruments, which kind of musician has to use, because even within the musician, there is a gradation. So, so for example, the Mridangam and the Veena, I'm just giving an example, would be used by a particular kind of, musicians. Those who have to, maybe it's the Mridangam, I'm not sure, but those who have to beat the drums. And the drums are, the base of the drum has the animal skin. They would belong to, they would be placed hierarchically lower. So you find, these kind of divisions between the musicians. That's very, very evident. And the role of the musicians in the temple rituals is also very well documented. So it is the musicians who have access, but again, not the kind of access which the priests would have. All right. So I would assume that located within the frame of the musicians and their access, the Devdasis would also, have the similar, they would also have a similar kind of a status.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you.
Shalin sir would like to ask a question. So, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ranjita. Ranjita, I was just wondering, you referred to the corporate bodies of the merchants, right? So I was just wondering, was it so that over a period of time, these corporate bodies of the merchants, they also evolved as the political bodies through which the merchants voiced their protest? And if so was the case, does it also then signify say a shift in the political gravity? I would say a downward political gravity, where there is a more locally rooted powers which are getting linked to the system. Was it so?
Yes. In fact, the mercantile bodies, the corporate bodies do articulate protest. I've talked about the craftsmen bodies articulating protest when they refuse to pay taxes because they feel it's an unfair levy. They threaten, that they will abandon the city and go away, and then they have to be wooed, back and made to stay. So the corporate bodies are very crucial. We cannot deny the existence and the role of the corporate bodies. In fact, the corporate bodies of the merchants are very crucial in fixing the prices. Since I was not including the merchants, but in fixing the prices of the commodities, and sometimes they, land up in conflict with the temple authorities over certain kind, over pricing certain commodities. So that is there. Control of, marketing certain commodities is also in the hands of the mercantile bodies. You also have mercantile merchants, individual merchants from as far as Kerala region, and in fact beyond that, also coming and making gifts. And these are mostly horse merchants. All right, so it's not that they're passing by. They just, for them, they're making this special kind of a journey to Srirangam. You see, Srirangam also became an archetype for various towns and cities in South India. In fact, Srirangapatnam is sort of modeled on that. In fact, in Vrindavan in North India, which is closer to Delhi, there is a Rangaji temple, which is modeled on the Ranganatha Swami temple. So, that's another, area where which are these places, where you have, the influence, the idea of Srirangam, influencing them. So it became a sort of an archetype, also for various people. So you have, mercantile corporate bodies crucial, and they do make demands. There is a certain attempt at social mobility, but mind you, there is no corporate social mobility, that as a group they're trying to have a social mobility. It's mostly individual social mobility. And whether the merchants played an important role in the political configuration, I'm not very I would like to think yes, it is a possibility which is worth exploring, but for that one has to look at sources afresh, and for perhaps also look at more sources, because I think the idea of politics and state is just not, the few actors at the top, but it also involves a larger part of the society too. So in that sense, yes, we do need to, revisit our sources and also find new sources to understand this.
Thanks.
Ma'am, Aditi has another query.
Yeah, I can see, why was the status of artisans declining in the 16th century? This is a question, Aditi, even I've asked myself. Considering that, there is every potential of the status of the artisans rising, and, they have been rising. But why are they declining in the 16th century? But they're declining, you must remember, within the temple. not outside the temple. All right. So the possible answer that I could think of within the temple is that the religious groups, are now making, because you see, this is 16th century is a period of immense economic change. You have huge amount of prosperity, land grants, rituals, festivals, all, taking place. The nexus between politics and, the city is becoming more and more vibrant. So very clearly, there is an attempt to edge out these artisans and claim those spaces, which belonged to them. And it is true. I mean, it has been argued by various scholars that there has been an attempt by Brahminical groups to appropriate, these positions, because clearly the positions which were held by the artisanal groups in the temples are no longer with them by the 16th century. It is with these religious groups. And there is a nexus between the religious groups and the Vijayanagar rulers and the post-Vijayanagar rulers. So there's a clear, patronage client relationship which is happening between the two. So it is here that probably we can see this reason of the status of artisans declining within the temple, not outside the temple, within the temple in the 16th century. Yeah.
If there's any more question or comment, please feel free to write in the chat box or ask. Is there anyone?
Okay, I have been told by Aditi, thank you, ma'am. Okay, maybe to my answer or maybe to my talk. Yeah.
So is there anyone else who has some doubt, wants to
I
ask?
think I can see one Kirti's question, Kirti Kanojia.
Kirti, yeah, please go ahead. Please ask. Kirti, please ask.
You can either unmute yourself or type in the chat box. Do either of the two, whatever is better for you.
Changes in participation during festivities? No, there isn't. In fact, changes in the sense that more and more people are joining these festivals, because you see, the festivals are celebrated in various. The question which Kirti is asking is that, have you seen changes in the participation during festivities? In the festivities, no. In fact, more and more people are joining. The festival processions appear to be longer. We don't find much information about who are the members who are participating in these festival processions, but very clearly there were drummers, there were musicians, there were devadasis, there were people who were given certain honors in the temple. So there is a large, crowd of, non-Brahmin social groups in these festivities. What, if possible, I don't know whether it is possible, because, in the medieval and early modern period in India, we are actually hindered by our sources. If it is possible to examine which are these various social groups, which are the social groups which are not included, but that is not the case. The festivals find, the processions particularly find everybody participating in it, to the extent that the same festival in one particular period has a certain area of circulation, and let us say next year or 10 years later, the same festival procession, its geographical route of circumambulation widens, which means that it is trying to reach to more and more people who are living in the city, and particularly in the rural hinterland. So you will have in one instance, or let's say in one particular year, the circumambulation or the processional routes during the festivals, limited, and in the next year they suddenly widen. In fact, you also find that there are references which are being there are injunctions which are being sort of issued, that kindly spend more time in that particular village, kindly stay there for 2 nights, kindly stay there for 3 nights. And then stories are created that this is the village where Lord had come when he was young, and he played here, and hence he was respected by the people, and while he was leaving this place and going to the temple at Sri Rangam, he promised he'll come back. So these kind of stories are also woven to justify the the stopover of the procession for a longer period. That you find, all these things you find increasing year by year. Those don't decrease. All right. So you see, I feel that while on one hand, the festivals, the rituals, the economy of the town is vibrant, prosperous, and is has lots of profit in it. That profit is also filtering into the temple. To control that, that is where the conflict starts arising. And it is in that conflict, probably in the 16th century, we find that the acharyas, particularly the monastic organizations, sort of assert themselves, and they have the support and the patronage of the political elites, the Veda ruler and the Nayakas.
Thank you, ma'am. Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions?
Well,
Ajita, please go ahead. Please ask. You can type in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Ajita, I guess she's typing.
okay, no problems. I can wait.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I'll ask.
Yeah,
Ranjeeta,
please.
I basically wanted to understand how this urban town that you have described, it had reached a stage where its integration with the hinterland. I mean, I'm going into what Headsman's description of the 3 case studies that he does, and he's writing on Kanchipuram. On the basis of that, the understanding that I get of a city or a town which grows in the medieval period is consistently associated with its environs, the rivers and the land. So it's not, it's the description of the urban is also, as you have given us, of a temple town. I don't get a picture of that. So can you please tell me how to relate to this particular? Perhaps I'm not aware of the sources that are that you are using. Perhaps it's relevant to Sri Rangam, and you're talking about a period and different environs totally. So it could be that.
No, my question is not the expansion of the, that is not what I'm dealing with. It becomes a part of it, but I'm actually dealing with the question of urbanity and the role of religion in it. So it is, in fact, I'm trying to move away from the kind of work which Heidsman and all do. The problem with urbanization in medieval India is that either you just describe the towns, or you are talking about the economic, the economic aspects of what is happening in the town. You are constantly categorizing the towns. So, like you have, port town, temple town, capital cities, and so on, and so administrative towns. So you have these constant categorizations also taking place, but that is not my attempt at all here. I'm not talking at all of how the town is expanding, etc. I'm actually talking about the fact that, and it arises from the concern that when we talk of urbanity and urban processes, and this has happened in areas outside India, there has always been an attempt to look at only the economic factors, and religion is just it's separate. It's just kept separate. So my idea is actually to show that it's an integral part of the urbanization, and the urban is influenced by the religion, and religion is also influenced by the urban within that particular environment, within that particular sector. So my attempt is not at all to talk about the expansion. That's not what I'm attempting at. I'm attempting at the fact that how, when both of them interact, what are the possibilities with which then you can also examine the place. So, this entire thing about, the fact that a city is a secular space, which is something which we are constantly grappling with, and, is something which needs to be questioned. So, the city versus the village, I mean, these things really need to be questioned. So this is what I'm actually trying to do. And then if we talk about religion, then we're talking about the description of the temple in this particular case, or we are talking about, priest A or Acharya A interacting with Acharya B. It's important. I'm not denying that, but the point is that, which is one part of it, but we also have to integrate these ideas or integrate the religious process in the process of urban. So my thing is that how religion influences the quality of the urban, the characteristic of an urban. That's what I'm focusing at. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to a small, Srijani, I was just wanting to ask, in relation to what Ranjeeta has been saying, it is such a fascinating lecture, Ranjeeta. And on this temple town thing, naming and categorization, etc., I was thinking, what would be a near from medieval, early modern period, equivalent term for us to use in the vernacular, regional, indigenous language for, say, temple or temple town, so that maybe we can just go to the original term and think about it. And then perhaps say that whether it is legitimate to call it temple town, etc. So perhaps it will take us closer to the time and period in terms of the original, from the sources that you have seen. What would be the term for Srirangam and the temple itself? Because mandir, even mandir is a late term, isn't it? Mandir is a very, very late term. So perhaps this can help.
Yes, thank you so much for making this suggestion, Razi, because I actually hadn't thought of it, because you see the word temple town, temple city is actually coming in the 19th century, and it is being attributed by Patrick Geddes. In fact, Professor Narayani Gupta has a delightful piece in the print. She published this 9-part series on called Reading the City, which was also figuring in Sahapedia. It's really delightful reading it. It sort of capsules all these issues. So Patrick Geddes in the 19th century, who's a planner, who's an urban planner, he's a sociologist. He is the one who uses the word temple city because he feels that the temple determines, the landscape, the urban scape, and it determines the life of the people there. And in fact, he was trying to basically preserve that kind, what he thought was the ethos. So for example, he said, don't open universities afresh. In all these tall temple towers, in the gopurams, open universities there. And he said that instead of looking, then he also said something very interesting, that instead of looking into the temple, look at other spaces which are outside the temple, where people would collect under a tree, or where there would be nooks and corners not on the regular streets, and just see that what is happening there, how they are a part of the city. So he has very interesting insights actually. So he uses the word temple town. So it's a 19th century concept in many, now you're very right that I actually also have missed this, that what would it be called in the sources? Probably I took it so much for granted, that I have to work on this. But clearly, from what I, from what I remember, I only find the name being given constantly, and the name of Srirangam is actually given as a sacred site for Vishnu. All right, where Vishnu is supposed to have manifested himself at some point in the cosmic past, and so has Shiva. So it's actually called a sthalam. That's a word which I remember being used constantly. But then what is it called?
Prasada is not used.
Sorry?
Is prasada is not used? Prasada or
prasada would be offerings, isn't it?
No, prasada is a term for
palace. For temple,
palace and temples both.
No, yeah, koil is definitely used. It is called the Periya koil. Koil is used for the temple. The word sthala comes, keeps coming in the Alvar literature, in the Alvar songs. Thereafter, I have to confess that, I sort of never bothered, because this category of engaging with, the nomenclature of Temple Town is something which keeps coming back to me, but I keep brushing it under the carpet, thinking I'll take it up later, and then look at, and so I start looking at other things. But it's a good suggestion. Definitely, I think we should go into that. Yeah.
So I'm assuming there are no more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, this talk is being streamed live on Facebook also, and there are many comments appreciating the lecture, but there are no more questions there. So I will go ahead with the vote of thanks. So thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us and for this very insightful talk. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Our next webinar with Dr. Luther Obrock, titled Kings Fall Apart, The Dissolution of Sovereignty and the Problem of History in Sanskrit Literature, will be held on Wednesday, 8th September at 7 p.m. We hope to see you there too. Till then, stay safe, take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being there and being patiently listening to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.